reasonable.
Good day, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brenda Stoddard with FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Small Business and Industry Assistance Program, also known as CDER, SBIA. Thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation, which will provide insight on FDA's recommendations on the use of electronic health record data in FDA-regulated clinical investigations. The webinar itself will be posted in its entirety, both video and audio, on our website within 5 business days. And that website is www.fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars with an S at the end. Before we begin, I would like to cover some details. Slides for today's presentation are available from the right-hand side of your screen where the orange button says Download Presentation. This activity in its entirety has been pre-approved by RAPS as eligible for up to 1 credit towards a participant's RAC-RSC recertification, and it is also SQA approved for 0.25 non-GCP or non-GLP units per 1 hour towards RQAP re-registration. You will be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. What that means, it will close on December the 20th. And even if you don't need a certificate, we would really appreciate it if you let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1 hour. Our presentation will be followed by a brief 5-minute pause, and we will resume with our Q&A session after the pause. Our speakers today will be Leonard from the Office of Medical Policy, Mitra Rocca from the Office of Translational Sciences, and Cheryl Grandinetti from the Office of Scientific Investigations. And we now welcome our first speaker, Dr. Leonard Sachs. Thank you, Dr. Sachs.
Hello, thank you, Brenda, and thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar on electronic health records in clinical investigations. I just wanted to cover a little bit of the contents of today's presentation. We're going to cover the reasons that we wrote the guidance, and I'll talk about that shortly. We're going to talk about the challenges and the opportunities with the use of electronic health record data in clinical investigations. We're going to talk a little bit about the information technology aspects of these systems, interoperability and integration of systems, and we're going to finish off with a fairly detailed dive into the guidance, which describes best practices for ensuring the quality and the integrity of electronic health record data in clinical investigations. So I thought it was a good idea to start the session with a quick review of our regulations as they relate to medical records. And this is the section that comes out of 21 CFR 312. What it says is an investigator is required to prepare and maintain adequate and accurate case histories that record all observations and other data pertinent to the investigation on each individual administered the investigational drug or employed as a control in the investigation. Case histories include the case report forms and supporting data, including, for example, signed and dated consent forms, and medical records, including, for example, progress notes of the physician, the individual's hospital charts, and the nurse's notes. In the paper environment, prior to the sort of adoption of electronic health records, this was satisfied by clinical notes by investigators, physical copies of pertinent information from the paper's records, Xeroxes and faxes, physical reports from laboratories and imaging services and other consultants. This has all been integrated in electronic health systems. And clearly, as electronic health records become the norm, there are aspects of these records, such as the quality, reliability, confidentiality, and inspections that we need to address. Besides these issues, we realize that many patients and caregivers are involved in both clinical care and research, yet the record systems used for care and research are often completely separate. This disconnect quite logically leads to inefficiencies. First of all, data must be separately entered into 2 different systems, So this results in duplication of work and transcription errors. Individuals are looking into one computer and transcribing into another, or from paper into computers, and this obviously increases error. The other important aspect is that things may happen to a patient in a trial that healthcare providers need to know, and vice versa. Things may happen during the clinical care of a patient that researchers need to know, but these two worlds are not communicating efficiently when the systems are separate. Another point is that follow-up of patients in the clinical care environment may reveal important findings on safety and the efficacy of new medical products that are really not captured in the framework of a clinical trial. So the challenges we face, again, as I mentioned, paper hospital charts and progress notes have been used in the past to satisfy FDA's requirements for these records. Electronic health records provide us with a new technological opportunity to integrate healthcare and clinical research. Now, electronic health records, as you all know, are not regulated by FDA. They're systems which are owned and managed by healthcare providers, and FDA does not intend to assess compliance of these systems with our Part 11 regulations, which are the regulations dealing with the quality of electronic records. So we don't intend to assess Part 11 for electronic health records. Existing standards for electronic health records are already established, and those which meet the criteria for safety and reliability may satisfy FDA requirements for clinical records. And you'll hear a little bit more about this later on. So among other challenges, the one I wanted to highlight is how can electronic health records satisfy FDA's regulations on electronic records, on audit trails, data attributability, record retention, and patient confidentiality. There are a number of different opportunities apart from improving the efficiencies and eliminating errors in transcription. There are different ways in which electronic health records can be incorporated into clinical investigations. At their most basic level, they may serve as a source for pure data extraction, static data, like things like patient demographics, possibly concomitant medications and other long-term issues in the history. Another very important aspect to electronic health records is that they serve as a source of real-world data in clinical investigations. And this is an important component in our response to the 21st Century Cure Act. It gives us the opportunity to look at a wealth of new data that was not previously available in clinical investigations. It gives us a chance to look at long-term outcomes, rare outcomes, which we weren't able to see in smaller clinical trials, and potentially gives us access to larger numbers of patients. So many potential advantages to use of electronic health records for the purposes of real-world data. Finally, the part that we're interested in is integrating systems where the investigator and the clinician use the same system. This clearly improves communication between the clinical research and the clinical care constituencies, and improves efficiencies. The other thing that is obvious is that in many cases, the investigator and the clinical caregiver are the same person. It seems really unnecessary to have these individuals doing things in duplicate. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mitra Rocca, to tell us a little bit about the IT aspects of electronic health records as we're looking at it. Okay, Mitra.
Thank you, Leonard. So as Leonard mentioned, I'm going to talk about the interoperability and integration of systems, mainly focusing on electronic health record, EHR, and electronic data capture or EDC systems. So what is interoperability? Interoperability is defined as the ability of two or more systems to be able to exchange information and also to be able to use the information that has been exchanged. So in this guidance, we have identified three types of EHR and EDC systems integration: non-interoperable, interoperable, and fully integrated. The first type is non-interoperable system, and this requires manual transcription of data elements from the EHR to the electronic case report form or ECRF or the paper case report form. The interoperable systems enable electronic transmission of relevant EHR data to the EDC system. Examples of relevant EHR data are data from labs, demographic, vital sign, and medications. And an interoperable EHR and EDC system could provide access to additional patient information populated from other clinical information systems. And examples of other clinical information systems are radiology information system and lab information system. And fully integrated systems allows clinical investigator to enter research data directly into the EHR systems. For example, there is a research tab built into the EHR system where the clinical investigator could directly enter the data into the EHR system. So in this guidance, we have identified 4 recommendations focusing on EHR and EDC system integration. The first one is use of open consensus-based data standards, followed by exchange of structured and unstructured data, validation, and data from multiple EHR systems. So the first recommendation is focusing on data standards. So we recommend leveraging the existing open data standards for the data exchange between EHR and EDC system. Example of open consensus-based data standards are standards developed by Health Level 7 or HL7 as well as CDER. So they are developed by Standards Development Organization or SDOs. Ensure that the integrity and security of data are not compromised. And Cheryl is going to talk about some of the challenges with the data standards have been addressed by Office of National Coordinator for Health Information Technology Health IT Certification Program, which Cheryl is going to provide you with additional detail. Exchange of structured data. Exchange of structured data between EHR and EDC systems so that data may be entered once at the point of care and used many times. So the concept is called enter once, reuse many times. So then the data is entered into EHR system once and then it's reused by the EDC system. And examples of structured data are also demographic, vital sign, medication, adverse event. Then ensure that the structured data elements obtained from the EHR correspond with the protocol-defined data collection plan, for example, time and measurement. Exchange of unstructured data. EHR data also capture unstructured data. For example, the physician note might be in unstructured format. So when leveraging unstructured data that is captured in EHR system, we recommend considering the reliability and quality of this data and appropriateness of using this as the source data, especially focusing on the clinical endpoints. Validation. For validation, we recommend that the sponsor ensure that the interoperability of EHR and EDC system functions in a manner intended in a consistent and repeatable fashion, that the data are transmitted accurately, consistently, and completely. And also the sponsor should ensure that the software updates to the sponsor's EDC system do not affect the integrity and security of the EHR data that is transmitted to the sponsor's EDC system. And validation and data quality management plans. An example of data quality management plans are standard operating procedures and other types of data quality management plans that is provided, developed by sponsor. So the data quality management plan should address the interoperability of the EHR and EDC system and the automated electronic transmission of EHR data elements to the EDC system. And the sponsor should periodically check a subset of the extracted data for accuracy, consistency, and completeness within the EHR source data and make appropriate changes to the interoperable system. Data from multiple EHR systems. So if data from multiple EHR systems, for example, the data is captured from one EHR system from one institution, and then there is that then is transmitted to another EHR data from another institution, then that data from the other EHR, from other institutions' EHR system could be transmitted and used in the sponsor's EDC system. But the data sharing agreement should be in place between these different institutions if their EHR system are being leveraged. And now I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl, and she's going to continue with the presentation.
So thank you, Mitra. So as Mitra said, today I'm going to discuss the best practice section of the guidance, and I'm going to, as Leonard said, take a deep dive into the recommendations in the guidance. So I'm going to talk about using ONC certified EHR technology and why we think this is a good idea, using any EHR technology that's not certified, what sponsors should consider in terms of the data integrity controls that should be in place when using data from these systems in FDA-regulated clinical investigations. I'll also discuss some general best practices, how to apply e-source principles to EHRs, and considerations for informed consent. And then finally, I'll talk about what we want to see in terms of inspection, record keeping, and record retention requirements. First, let me just reiterate what Leonard said earlier in his presentation, is that FDA does not intend to assess EHRs for compliance with Part 11. And again, to remind everyone, Part 11 is our regulation for electronic records and electronic signatures. And the regulation essentially describes the minimum controls and attributes of electronic systems that we feel are necessary to help ensure that the electronic record and data are trustworthy. And I'll talk a little bit more about these data integrity controls that are found in Part 11 a little later on in the presentation. But the main reason that we don't intend to assess EHRs for Part 11 compliance is that EHRs are owned and managed by healthcare institutions and not by sponsors. So we really can't hold sponsors responsible for ensuring that EHR systems are compliant with the Part 11 regulations. Also, the performance standards for EHR systems are regulated by other authorities and not FDA. So, for example, in the U.S., it's HHS's Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology that oversees health IT, including EHRs, and they've established a voluntary certification program under the HITECH Act of 2009. Under this voluntary certification program, certified EHR technologies would be in compliance with the meaningful use regulations that are found at 45 CFR Part 170. So if we're not assessing EHRs for compliance with Part 11, then what should you do and what do we want to see to give us some confidence in the integrity and trustworthiness of any EHR data that you're using in an FDA-regulated clinical investigation? Well, first, we would like to encourage you to use certified EHR technology. And secondly, we also want to see that there are appropriate policies and procedures in place for use of the EHRs at the clinical investigation site. So a little bit more here on this slide on why we encourage certified technologies. So these certified EHR systems are aimed toward ensuring interoperable data sharing, which we think is a good idea. And they're required to meet certain privacy and security protection requirements for an individual's health information. So use of certified systems would give us some confidence, not total confidence, but some confidence in the integrity of the data. So when we were writing this guidance, we compared the meaningful use privacy and security protection requirements to the data integrity controls found in Part 11 and saw that many of the system attributes described in Part 11 were covered in meaningful use. So to illustrate, I'll very quickly describe the data integrity controls found in Part 11, and then on the next slide, I'll talk about the privacy and security protection requirements found in meaningful use. And in the interest of time, I won't go through them all. I'll just give you an idea of what they are. So on this slide, as you can see, I've listed all the data integrity controls found in our Part 11 regulations. And Part 11 regulation describes various system attributes that are generally built into a system, such as access controls, so the need to limit access of your system to authorized users. And this is usually done by employing usernames and passwords, using biometrics, multi-factor authentication, or even one-time passwords. These are just examples of access controls. The regulation also describes the need for audit trails to identify who entered the data and when, and to track changes to the data. And then encryption to ensure data security. Then there are various system performance and system user controls that can't be built into the system. So like validation of electronic systems to ensure that the electronic system is performing its intended function correctly. And then system user controls like training of users to ensure users know how to use the system, and then establishing and adhering to standard operating procedures with regard to the use of these electronic systems. So now let's take a look at the privacy and security protection requirements found in the 2014 and 2015 meaningful use regulations. This regulation, as I said, covers many of the system attributes found in our Part 11 regulation. So for example, certified technology requires authentication of users, access controls, and authorization of users' action. So the certified technology must verify the identity of an individual based on a username and password or unique identifier. It also establishes the type and extent of access to the system a user is permitted based on their unique identifier. It requires automatic access timeouts, which will automatically stop a user's access to a system after a predetermined period of inactivity. And then certified technology also requires user authentication in order to resume or regain the access to the system that was stopped. It requires audit trails, and audit trails can't be changed, overwritten, or deleted by the technology, and the technology must be able to detect whether the audit log has been altered. The electronic health information that's stored must be encrypted. There is also the ability to encrypt electronic health information that's locally stored on the end user's device. So again, these system attributes compare to the system attributes found in our Part 11 regulation, and if employed, would certainly give us some confidence in the data. And again, not total confidence, but some confidence. So what further recommendations do we have so that we can have more confidence in the data, and what should you do? Well, when patient data from the EHR is being used in an FDA-regulated clinical investigation, the sponsor should assess each site's EHR system. And this could be done during the feasibility or the site initiation visit. The CRA at this visit should document the manufacturer and the version number of the EHR system and whether the EHR system is certified by ONC. And sponsors should include this step in gathering this information in their data management plan. If an EHR system is decertified during the course of a clinical trial, because that system no longer conforms to ONC's certification criteria, sponsors should determine the nature or reason for the nonconformity and to determine whether it would affect the quality and integrity of the data used in the clinical investigation. So we think that EHR systems that are not certified by ONC, including EHR systems at foreign clinical sites, can provide adequate data to inform FDA's regulatory decisions, provided that there are adequate controls in place to ensure the confidentiality, the integrity, and the security of the data. Again, those system attributes that we think are important and that should be in place, and again, I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record, they are access controls. Authors of records are identifiable. Audit trails should be available to track changes to the data. And then finally, this last recommendation is true for both certified and non-certified technology. The records should be available and retained for FDA inspection for as long as the records are required by applicable regulations. So if there is a clinical investigation site that's using a system that does not contain these adequate controls, then sponsors should consider the risk of using data from these systems in an FDA-regulated clinical investigation. Those risks being the potential harm to research subjects, violation of patient privacy rights, And then, of course, data integrity of the clinical investigation and its regulatory implications. That being that if we can't verify the integrity of the data, then we may not accept that data to support a regulatory decision. So we also wanted to give you some recommendations on what documentation you may want to consider reviewing to determine the suitability of EHRs without ONC certification. So one thing that you might find helpful is to review EHR system certification information from other authorizing bodies outside the United States, including information about the aspect of the EHR system that the authorizing body evaluated when certifying the EHR system. Also, what might be helpful is to review feature and product specification information from the EHR system vendor. So in addition to those built-in controls or those system attributes that I've been describing over and over again, the access controls, the audit trails, the encryption, there are other data integrity controls that can't be built into the system. So these recommendations that I'm going to go through now apply to both certified and non-certified EHR systems. So sponsors should ensure that there are appropriate policies and procedures for the use of EHRs at the clinical investigation site in place, and that appropriate security measures are employed to protect the confidentiality and integrity of the study data. So just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. So we're talking about policies such as not allowing users to share usernames and passwords, to log out of the system when they walk away, policies regarding training of individuals who use the system, things like that. Sponsors should also ensure that study monitors will be given and have suitable access to all relevant subject information pertaining to the clinical investigation as appropriate. So this access could be either, just as an example, direct access to the EHR, over-the-shoulder access. So they should just ensure that the monitors are going to be giving access to the data so they can monitor it. If there is a clinical investigation site that doesn't permit this, then maybe that site isn't the best site to participate in a clinical trial that's using EHR data. You should also discuss with the relevant FDA review division any unique issues or challenges that you encounter that relate to the data collection from the EHR. So we've also identified special considerations with regard to eSource principles. So for EHR data elements that are gathered during the course of a clinical trial, the data originator is the EHR. And identifying the EHR as the data originator is sufficient in this case because sponsors are not expected to know the details about all the users and devices and mobile health technologies that might contribute to a patient's EHR. In terms of data modification, so after data are transmitted from the EHR to the EDC system, then the clinical investigator or the delegated study personnel should be the only individuals authorized to make modifications or corrections to the data. And these modifications should reflect the date, time, data originator, and reason for the change. And again, these are modifications made to the data in the EDC system after the data are transmitted from the EHR system. The clinical investigator should review and electronically sign the completed electronic case report forms for each study participant, and if modifications are made to the electronic case report form after the clinical investigator has already signed it, then these changes should be reviewed and approved by the clinical investigator. There are some considerations for the informed consent. The informed consent regulations found at 21 CFR Part 50 states that the informed consent must include a statement describing the extent, if any, to which confidentiality of the records identifying the subject will be maintained. What we recommend is that the informed consent should identify entities such as healthcare providers, clinical investigators, sponsors, contract research organizations, study monitors, and regulatory agencies who may gain access to the patient's electronic health record that relate to the clinical investigation. Also, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Also, I just want to note here that under the HIPAA privacy rule, FDA doesn't need permission to inspect records containing health information. And so the informed consent should state that FDA may inspect records, and that should not state or imply that we need permission from the subject for access to these records. FDA also has specific inspection, record keeping, and record retention requirements that you'll need to consider as well. The regulations state that the clinical investigator must retain all paper and source documents and records pertaining to the clinical investigation. And FDA must have access and may inspect and copy all records pertaining to the clinical investigation. So what this means for EHR data is that all relevant information in the EHR pertaining to the clinical trial must be made available to FDA for review upon request. And it can be available and viewable to FDA as original records in the EHR or as certified copies. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about certified copies because we do get a lot of questions that come into the agency about this. So ICH E6 R2's definition of a certified copy, which FDA has adopted, is a copy of the original record that's been verified either by a dated signature or by generation through a validated process to have the same information, including data that describe the context, content, and structure as the original. So if your trial is using EHR data, then during an inspection, if screenshots or paper printouts of electronic health records are used to serve as a copy of the EHR, and that paper record fails to capture important metadata and audit trail information that are recorded in the EHR, then FDA would regard these records as incomplete unless the accompanying metadata and audit trail information are included. So if necessary, FDA may request to review the EHR audit trail information in the EHR during an inspection. We would recommend that sponsors and clinical investigators retain the ability to access the EHR data, associated metadata, and audit trail information should this access be requested during an FDA inspection. So let me just briefly summarize the main take-home points from today's presentation. So as Leonard mentioned, EHRs offer a rich source of real-world data in clinical investigations, and we encourage using EHR data in clinical investigations. The interoperability and integration of EHRs with the EDC system can increase the quality and efficiency of the clinical investigation by reducing the burden on study personnel and reducing the possibility of transcription errors, which may also increase the accuracy and completeness of the clinical trial data. And then finally, it's critical that sponsors assess the EHR system attributes as well as the policies and procedures for their use that are in place at the clinical investigation site to ensure that appropriate data integrity and data security controls are employed. So now we're going to take a short 5-minute break to review some of the questions that are coming in. So please stay with us while we take this break.
It's Leonard back here to answer a couple of questions. Let's see, there were two questions which were very similar. The one was FDA doesn't intend to assess EHRs, but what about other regulatory authorities if the clinical trial is global? Well, and the second question, which was very similar to me, was if FDA doesn't intend to assess EHR Part 11 compliance, what about other regulatory authorities? So, first of all, clearly Part 11 requirements are US FDA requirements. They're not requirements by other agencies. And obviously, we're not in a position to say what other regulatory agencies will do. I did want to just point out that the fact that we're not assessing Part 11 requirements doesn't mean that we're ignoring the quality of electronic health records. As Cheryl has described, there are other things that we would be interested in doing. We would want to know about these systems in terms of what their performance specifications are when they're not certified by the ONC. I guess the other important safeguard is that we need the ability to inspect the records so we can compare with what's in the case report form. So there are other ways in which we've tried to address the fact that we can't enforce Part 11 compliance, but we do want to make sure that the quality is good. There was another question about the quality of the information that goes into the EHR. I'll read the question. The extremely tight time limits on healthcare givers typically results in them entering data into the EHR systems quickly without as much regard to accuracy and completeness as we expect for clinical trials. Is there anything that addresses this core quality deficiency of EHR data? Well, no, there isn't, but this is the same as things were in the paper world. The clinical care records are separate from the records made by investigators. And we recognize that the case report form might be very specific in the type of data that's required, whereas the electronic health record is just health care data. So just like in the paper world, we cannot mandate the quality there. We can only inspect it. I think there were a couple of other questions which maybe Mitra can answer.
Thank you, Leonard. So the first question is, FDA does not intend to assess EHRs, but what are the regulatory authorities if clinical trial is global? Actually, Leonard answered that. How do standard development organizations or SDOs such as HL7 and CDER, among others, fit into the bigger picture? So SDOs such as HL7 and CDER could collaborate with other stakeholders in clinical research, sponsors, academia, sites, EHR and EDC vendors, and other vendors whose software or hardware is used in clinical investigation to conduct pilot projects. They can enhance their standards, they can collaborate with each other on mapping their standards to each other, and conduct connectathon, for example, the IHE connectathon integrating healthcare enterprise, or the HL7 FHIR connectathon. And examples are mapping of CDER to HL7 CDA, clinical document architecture, as well as the new standard developed by HL7 FHIR. And at FDA, we have a few ongoing projects focusing on leveraging standards in regulated clinical trials. The second question is, it looks like the ONC certification is a self-certification by the EHR company. Is that correct? No, actually. All products listed, so on the Office of National Coordinator for Health Information Technology website, all the EHR, all the health IT products that have been certified are listed on the CHPL or Certified Health IT Product List. And they have been tested by the ONC Health IT certification programs. And there is a ONC accredited testing lab that all the EHR systems are being tested. For example, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, is one of the testing labs that test the electronic health record systems. And then they are certified by an ONC, authorized certification body, or ONC ACB. And so that is where that was another question, where can I find the list of certified EHR systems? So they are on the ONC's website, and we can also send you the link. Then we have, I received another question. As you know, interoperability depends to a great extent on harmonizing data models. Can you speak briefly to FDA's work in this area? So we have a project at FDA focusing on harmonizing 4 large common data models. These 4 large common data models are FDA Sentinel Common Data Model, OMOP or Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership Common Data Model, PICORNet, and I2B2. And the goal is to be able to harmonize these 4 models, so a researcher at FDA or NIH or academia could ask a question from any of these 4 large networks for post-market surveillance and also for pre-market. I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl to continue answering your questions.
Okay, let's see. One of the questions that just came in is, it says, for clinical vendors developing interoperable software for EHR to EDC integration, who is responsible for obtaining documentation of EHR certification, the software vendor or the sponsor? Well, I think that the sponsor is responsible for retaining that documentation. The vendor certainly can get it for the sponsor and give it to them, but we would like the sponsor to obtain that documentation. Let's see. And then it says, additionally, is the software vendor required to be disclosed within the informed consent? Now, I think it's just the entities that have access to the patient's healthcare information, so that they're actually looking at their data. Those should be the individuals that are listed in the informed consent. Let's see. Another question we got was, if data from the EHR is transmitted to an intermediary system by the clinical site before being captured in the sponsor's EDC system, do all the recommendations for EHR policies and procedures also apply to the intermediary system? For example, should the intermediary system have an audit trail, use encryption, and apply user authentication and authorization techniques? I would say yes. That all of the same system attributes and other data integrity controls that I discussed in the presentation also applies to the intermediary system if data for the clinical investigation is going into that system before being transferred to the EDC system. Let's see. Here's another question. It says, is the PI required to review audit trails of EHRs? And should this be required? What is the frequency, and does this review have to be documented? No, the PI is not required to review audit trails of the EHRs. There's no regulation that states that they're required to do that. And not only is there no regulation, we don't even have a recommendation in our guidance where we ask for the PI to do that. So the answer is no to that question. Here's another question. It says that we noted in the presentation that the assessment should be done by CRAs. This is the EHR assessment. And it says, from a technology perspective, how much of a concern is it that many CRAs are not savvy with the technology and what they should be looking for? Well, I would say that there might be some training that needs to be done. I don't think you have to be 100% technology savvy to look for the things that I mentioned in the presentation. So I think that there should be some training of your CRAs that should occur. Again, and this is in cases where you are using data from the EHR in your clinical investigation, as we described in the guidance. So that was the answer to that question. So maybe I'll pass the baton back to Leonard, and we'll just keep taking turns here. Is that all right, Leonard?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So there are a couple of questions here about whether the PI would be responsible to make updates to the original EHR system. So really the PI is not part of the EHR, he's part of the EDC or part of the electronic case report form system. So I don't think he would be expected to make any changes to the EHR system. But another question asks whether the sponsor is responsible to capture data changes in the EHR after the data has already been collected in the ED system. And there's really no good practical way to align changes that happen in the EHR after it's been transmitted to the ED system. We've discussed this at length. It's similar to the paper situation where data may be extracted from paper records and things may happen afterwards. So I think the important thing is that when the data enters the ED system, it has a date time stamp and we know when it comes from. And if the EHR has the correct credentials, in other words, audit trails, it should be obvious that changes or updates to the EHR happen subsequent to the transmission of the data, so we can at least figure out what happened in sequence. Obviously, I mean, there's nothing wrong with an investigator finding out from a patient that something happened, checking back with the EHR and finding out that that's been changed, in which case they can apply the changes to the electronic case report form or the EDC. I'm just trying to see if there are any others here. No, I think, Mitra, did you have any others there? Yeah.
Thanks, Leonard. We have some additional questions. Do we as a sponsor need to assess the EHR's policies and procedures to ensure data integrity? Yes. And the sponsor could review the standard operating procedure from EHRs and also the documentation provided by EHR and to be able to assess the integrity of data. To ensure seamless, this is another question we received, to ensure seamless data mapping and transfer between EHR and EDC system, what kind of standards can be used? Will the EDC vendors certify themselves against different EHR platform, Epic, Cerner, Allscripts to ascertain that sponsor can easily use their system? This is an excellent question. So as I mentioned before, it would be great to leverage HS7 FHIR, which stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and to integrate electronic health record and electronic data capture systems. Since the EDC vendors don't have there is no certification program for them, but only for EHR system, then the EDC vendors could collaborate with multiple EHR vendors to enable this integration between their system and the EHR system. I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl to continue with questions.
Hi. Okay. So one of the questions that we got is, when will the guidance go into effect? This is a final guidance, so it's already in effect. Let's see. Here another question is, Part 11 notes the requirements to apply to documents submitted in support of a submission. Based on this talk and others I have seen, it seems that Part 11 only applies to data submitted to FDA, data in the CRF. Is that correct? So Part 11 applies to required records, so whether they're submitted or not to FDA, if they're required in the regulation, then Part 11 would apply. So if those records are maintained in electronic format and not paper. Also, we further state that any record that is an essential document as defined by ICH E6, so it's used to reconstruct the trial, and it's maintained in electronic format, then Part 11 would apply to those records as well. Okay. So another question that we received is, how would the sponsor know if the EHR was decertified during a clinical trial? My answer to that would be ask the PI. Not sure if that's the right answer, but that's my answer. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'm going to pass the ball to Leonard now, because all of these questions have been answered.
A couple more questions here about changes to the EHR. This question says, remaking changes to the EHR, what happens if data errors are found in the EDC during data validation? Will the data corrections need to be made to the EHR? Well, we don't have any mandate to say what needs to happen in the EHR, but it certainly sounds a good opportunity for communication between the two systems. Our interest will be that if there are mismatches between the data in the EHR and the EDC, they should be reconciled, and the audit trail should help figure out whether changes were made to the EHR after the data entered the EDC. I'm just trying to see if there's another question for me here.
We received two more questions. The first question, are there currently any health institution EHR integrated with industry EDC in the USA? Yes, we have actually a project that is managed by FDA, and I actually lead that project. It's with University of California in San Francisco, and they are collaborating with the EPIC, which is their EHR system, and Open Clinical is their EDC vendor to integrate their EHR and EDC. And also Duke University has been also has similar pilots, and they have also integrated their EHR with their EDC system. And the second question, are there any standards that need to be followed in the transfer of the data from the EHR system to the EDC system? Yes, the standards from CDER for clinical research, as well as standards developed by HL7 that are mandated by the ONC certification program. They need to be followed. I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl again.
Okay, this is the last question that we're going to take today. So the question is, should the EHR to EDC intermediary software meet specifically the ONC certification controls or Part 11 controls? So if I understand the question correctly, I think the question is asking whether the interoperability piece needs to be Part 11 compliant. And the interoperability piece doesn't necessarily need to be Part 11 compliant, but what we say in the guidance is that we want that piece validated. So that's what we'll want to see on inspection, is the validation documentation that piece was validated. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brenda.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to all these questions that came in from the audience. A few closing reminders that this particular activity has been pre-approved both for RAPs and for SQA credits. You will be able to turn the attendance certificate, which will testify for those credits upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks and closes on December 20th. You will be able to actually access the survey from the last slide here. You can also download the PDF of today's slides from this click, and we will also be sending out a thank you email with the link to the survey tomorrow. So you have many mechanisms for accessing the survey. Please again continue and do the survey for us, even if you don't need a certificate of attendance. So on behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we thank you for your attendance. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, and that will be advertised on our website at www.fda.gov, CDER SBIA webinars. And in keeping with the season, happy holidays to everyone, and thank you.